I'd like to welcome everybody today to Hidden Stories of York Region. This is season 3 and our first episode in season 3. Hidden Stories of York Region is a Made in York Region podcast series aimed at disrupting the dominant narratives by sharing stories and lived realities, community issues, and innovative solutions across the region. Each episode features guest speakers living and or working in York Region. Our conversations tackle challenging community issues and identify solutions and actions for change. My name is Yvonne Kelly, and I will be your host for episode 1 of Hidden Stories of York Region. Affordable and accessible housing is a human right, and it is essential to the infrastructure and health of our communities. The needs and challenges are so great that we are devoting all 4 episodes of season 3 to the housing challenges in York Region. Hidden Stories acknowledges that our work takes place on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge that we work, live, and play on the ancestral lands of all Indigenous peoples who have left their knowledge before us. We acknowledge those who walk the lands now and future generations to come. Hidden Stories is committed to sharing the truths, realities, and knowledge of Indigenous communities in York Region. To many, the vast area comprising the 9 municipalities north of Toronto looks like an idyllic image of suburban affluence, large family homes, grassy backyards, schools, and shopping in close proximity. But beyond the facade live the hidden stories of people in the region who struggle with access to housing, safe places to live, and a sense of community that so many of us take for granted. With me today are Michael Braithwaite, CEO of Boor, and John Taylor, Mayor of the town of Newmarket. Michael Braithwaite has worked in the not-for-profit sector for over 29 years. For the last 11 years, he's worked with organizations dedicated to preventing and ending homelessness. Currently, he is the CEO for Boor, a charity in York Region working to rapidly rehouse men, families, and youth, as well as providing them access to health and employment services. Michael's past roles include a long-term stint at the YMCA, CEO of 360 Kids, and most recently as CEO of Raising the Roof. He's a Brock University and Georgian College graduate and is very proud of his board work both with Family Day, GTA, and with the innovative and amazing Away Home Canada team. Welcome, Michael. John Taylor is currently mayor for the town of Newmarket, representing the town on both town council and York Region Council. He was first elected to council as a regional councillor in 2006 and served for 12 years in that role. Over the time on council, John has sat on all town and regional committees. Among others, he currently sits on the Newmarket Economic Development Advisory Committee, the Human Services Planning Board of York Region, and the region's Housing Affordability Task Force. John also sits on the Association of Municipalities of Ontario's Housing and Homelessness Task Force. John was born and raised in Newmarket and attended high school locally. He holds bachelor's degrees in English and education, a master's degree in Canadian studies, and a PhD in education. Welcome, John. So I want to kick us off with a question that I want to pose to both of you. So I'll go to Michael first. And because this podcast and this episode in particular is really looking at the trends, a bit of historical context to housing in the region of York, coming up to this last couple of years when a housing crisis was declared by the region. Can each of you give us a bit of an overview of what you've seen in the region, the trends that you've seen in your work, and where we've come to today? So we'll start with Michael, and then we'll ask John to come into that conversation.
Thanks, Yvonne. I think to really look back, you have to paint a picture of York Region. You have 9 municipalities. It's vastly spread out. And so when most people think of homelessness and you ask most people, where does homelessness exist? They think about the downtown core. They think about it being a big city type of problem. And I think for the longest time, York Region itself really thought that too, because it was out of sight, it was out of mind. It didn't happen here. And for the longest time, we really didn't pay attention for a long time. And then it became evident that there was quite a need here and we were playing catch up. What we've also seen over the past 10 years is just, of course, the cost of housing has continued to skyrocket, right? I think recently the Globe and Mail put out something saying household income of $90,000 a year is needed to afford a one-bedroom apartment in the GTA. And we think of many of the clients that we serve at Blue Door, that when they're receiving Ontario Works welfare or disability ODSP, annually you might have $8,000 to $13,000 a year. So there's a huge gap. So the reality for a lot of our clients and people experiencing homelessness is you're not looking anymore to rent an apartment, you're looking to rent a room in a place. But even then, you're looking at $600 to $800. If we can find that $600 unicorn where they have a room and the shared bathroom and kitchen, someone on Ontario Works is looking at just over $100 a month left over for food, travel, transportation, and all other necessities, right, moving forward. So it's become harder and harder for nonprofits, charities like Blue Door and others to house our most vulnerable. And that continues as housing prices and costs continue to climb.
Thanks, Michael. And I think we'll take that question over to John. John, you've had a long history. You grew up here. What kind of trends and changes have you seen that bring us to today?
Wow, so many changes, certainly over that period of time, from growing up here to now. That's a long period of time. But, I'll start with, and Michael was sharing some statistics. The one statistic that jumps out for me powerfully and has been accurate for a number of years now, unfortunately, which is that in the last decade, average housing prices have gone up about 120%, and the average household income has gone up about 20%. And when you take those two numbers in combination, that spells crisis every way you spell it. So we can paint that picture in many ways. But what I think I on the ground, when you feel like tangibly what your experience is when talking with people or having residents contact you, and I unfortunately get more and more contacting me who are in absolute immediate crisis. And they're so, frankly, so desperate. They're saying, why don't I just call the mayor? Maybe, there's something that can be done. And that's happening more and more. But on the sort of the granular level, the ground level, what I see more and more is that there's always been people who have been living living precariously. That's always existed. There's probably more now, yes. But what's really changed more than the number of people living precariously is the options that exist for those people living precariously. And those seem to be decreasing. And whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, there was some affordable rental in the general area you could find, or you could find a roommate and get by somehow, those options are just dwindling. The region's producing virtually no new affordable housing by various definitions. And so it's getting very difficult. And the demographics are changing. There's many more new Canadians arriving, and they don't have necessarily the support network of the community 30, 40 years ago, right? And so again, less resources, less ability to solve the problem or to find some way out. I'll finish with this though. I'm a endless, tireless optimist. I will say this though, that I've mentioned this maybe to you before, Yvonne, but when I started at the region 15 years ago, nobody really was that interested in being on the Housing York Committee, the housing committee. It was all about, building roads and bridges and transit. And now the elected population, the general population, are much more in tune with this issue. They see it now as an issue that needs attention, that needs thoughtful collaboration. And that trend makes me a little bit hopeful. I think even other levels of government, to varying degrees, are stepping in again much more significantly. And so I'm starting to get cautiously optimistic, and that's the other trend I'd like to put out there.
Appreciate your honesty in terms of what is actually happening. And so you've said that the region isn't producing enough. So let me take you to our next question, which is really, what type of housing do you think we need more of? John.
Yeah, sure. So actually, it's interesting because I'm sure Michael, Yvonne, you've heard this conversation many times. I'm actually getting a little tired of hearing it to a degree, but people will say, so can somebody define affordable housing for me? What is affordable housing? And it actually goes to the crux of your question. It's producing housing options that are safe and affordable for everyone. And so what do we need to produce in terms of housing? We need to produce as many different types and tenures and affordability points as we possibly can in a complete community. And one thing I've learned is that as much as I know we have a need to, and I have a passion to try to address issues of affordability for those who are the very most challenged, we need to do it for everyone, because it's everybody, not everybody, but there's large numbers in our population now growing with the cost of housing that are potentially precarious or slipping into crisis. And so we need to think about it for households of various incomes, and certainly those, in that 90,000 and down, because they're very challenging to find that. So I would say, like, let's produce all kinds of things. Let's produce co-op housing. Let's produce transitional housing. Let's produce stacked towns that are more affordable in home ownership. And for heaven's sakes, whatever we do, we need to produce dramatically higher numbers of rental, a private market rental and affordable rental, because the housing prices are going to create an insatiable demand for rental housing.
Thanks, John. Michael, what in your opinion contributes or has been contributing to the growing number of people experiencing homelessness more recently? Are there new groups that are experiencing homelessness that maybe haven't before?
I don't know if there's necessarily new groups that, or we see the growth, but I think some people that are overrepresented in the region, Indigenous people make up a very small part of the population, yet usually they're around 17% of the number of people experiencing homelessness. To us, LGBTQ plus youth, it's about 25% of youth experiencing homelessness, right? Overrepresented. But here's the thing right now. The federal government got out of building housing in the 90s, and you saw that's what contributed to more homelessness. Homelessness has always been a smaller issue, but now it's a massive issue because we stopped building thousands of affordable units, social housing in the 90s, and now we're trying to play catch up. So it's going to take a while. We need people's patience as we catch up, as we do these new builds. As the mayor said, we need a mix of housing. I think in the past where we've made mistakes, where we've taken hundreds of units and made it all affordable to people with lower incomes. You need mixed housing. The Regent Park models are excellent examples of that, right? So you do a bit of a mix. We also have to look throughout town. I mean, you could look at and throw it to the mayor to say, look, fire stations at different municipally owned buildings that might only have 2 floors. Can we use the airspace above that for more affordable housing and try and take advantage of that and challenge ourselves this way? Not my ideas, by the way. I have the good fortune of talking to a lot of very, very smart people who talk about, they say we could drive around and you look at strip malls and all these buildings that, have that airspace above them where we could put affordable housing because space is at a premium, right? So we have to be creative. We have to be open to new ideas. Blue Door right now is working with Habitat for Humanity. We've got a tiny house in Newmarket on a big piece of land, not well used, never purpose built for the use it's being used for emergency housing, which was very tough during the pandemic. So we're looking at Habitat. Could we do a mix of home ownership with Habitat, some affordable housing, some some market rent housing in one spot, as the mayor talked about, with those stacked towns that are a little more affordable. And can we do that together? So partnership is definitely something that we should be looking at with nonprofits and for profits, and thinking a little differently as we have to for innovation to move forward.
Would you also say that families have become more represented in the last 2 years? Because a lot of us are getting the impression that we are seeing a lot of families losing their homes, and there's different reasons for that, whether it's COVID, lack of income, evictions that maybe are on the increase.
Families, we're seeing, John mentioned a lot of new Canadians coming in, right? Larger families as well. We've had families up to 11. And think how difficult it would be to find an affordable home for 11 people, 9 people. So larger families coming in too, with diverse needs and different needs. The food banks do an annual survey, and there was a 47% increase in the amount of people using food banks this year. And of the people using food banks, once they pay for their housing, because usually they'll pay for housing, that's why they're at the food bank, they don't have enough left over for food. Your average person or family would have $9 left. And if you identify as Black or Indigenous, you would have $6 left. So we see like that number has continued to grow, those numbers. And so what do we do? And when we talk about John brought this, what is affordability? According to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corp, affordability is 80% of market rent. Well, if market rent for a 1-bedroom is $1,600, 80% is still not affordable for most. So we need that long-term, affordable, supportive, permanent housing for so many.
Thanks, Michael. John, you spoke earlier on about Newmarket as a complete community. So I'd like you to touch on that a bit more in the context of perhaps what is already happening in Newmarket around addressing housing affordability. What also maybe still needs to be done municipally and regionally with that goal of complete community.
I mean, when I say complete community, I'm saying it with a specific intent, which is that, and Daniele Zanate of the United Way has spoken to this very well over the years, particularly around the importance of human services. And so I think traditionally a complete community was sort of adjudicated by its ability to provide, hard services, like recreation centers and maybe a youth center, et cetera, which are all important things, a senior center. But when you get into these human services more, so I guess what I'm getting at is we've judged, I would make the argument, unfortunately, that we've often judged a complete community or a great community, if you want to call it, by how well it served 80% of the community. And that was the 80% that were doing pretty good. But rarely did anybody judge or adjudicate what is a complete or a healthy community by how well it was serving the 20% who live more precariously or who are having greater challenges. And I think that for me is what I mean. And so I don't want to be a community that considers itself complete until every member of the community is is living with the same dignity and the same kind of supports and access to services and as everyone else. And I think that's what I see. That's the part I see getting more challenging. It's getting harder and harder. And maybe it's due to population growth, and the more anonymous people become as community, it's harder to hold that community sense of support there. And I think we do a great job in Newmarket, but it's getting more challenging. And if I could add, in terms of how challenging it's going to get after COVID, 2-3 years after COVID, I would argue also don't begin to underestimate because it's early and we don't see the full picture yet. I think of the Ukrainian diaspora coming temporarily or semi-temporarily to our regions and our towns. The Ukrainian people, individuals, families, single moms are coming in so fast that they're looking, going like, where am I going to live 3 weeks from now? I need a job right away. And language is sometimes a limiting factor. And as Michael said, I had a family this 2 weeks ago reach out through somebody, and it was a family of 10 with virtually no English and a place to stay for 2 weeks. And so I think that is going to be very impactful and very challenging and on our communities, on housing, on homelessness, and making sure that, and I think we're not even close to prepared to doing this right. There's no moment where we're going to declare victory on this issue. There is no one approach that's going to solve it, but it requires a number of approaches over a number of years to make significant progress, not to declare victory. But where I'm going with this is that we've talked about some of those types of ways: land trust, transitional housing, modular housing, faith-based participation. There's so many ways you can go. But what I'm really worried about, when I was optimistic before, where I'm not as optimistic, is really in the last year or two, there's been a narrative that's emerging, supported by, frankly, the media, by the provincial task force, the province, even the federal government to a degree has participated in this, where everything's becoming about supply. And I think that's very, very dangerous way to address housing affordability. Is it important? Yes. Does it play a part in the solution or the path forward? Absolutely. But making everything about supply is, I think, is going to miss the mark considerably. And if we spend the next 2 years or 5 years where everybody's talking about and focused on supply, increasing housing supply, remember I talked about that 80-20, that 20% who has the greatest needs that you want to build a complete community for will gain nothing from increased housing supply, because that increased housing supply is going to be largely, if not entirely, if you look at the regional numbers, very expensive rental housing and very, very expensive home ownership. And so I just want to put that into the mix.
How big of a part is nimbyism? How alive and well, first of all, is nimbyism? Speak to that. You can tell people what the acronym is and how big of an issue is it in terms of making a challenge to build affordable.
So I'll jump off, Michael, because it's kind of a bit of my world there. But I read and by the way, if you haven't seen it, there's a very, very interesting article on this topic in the New York Times today or yesterday. A fascinating article that really drills down into one community and what's perceived to be and is to a certain degree nimbyism, and how much it affects things. I think it plays a role, but I'll be honest with you, my experience in 15 years is I haven't seen too much housing, affordable housing, or housing options not move forward because of nimbyism. I think it's dramatically declined, and where it still exists, I think clever people can find their way through it. And I think people working with organizations like Blue Door and the region or the town of Newmarket, some private developers can find your way through that puzzle. And so if somebody asked me where I want to put the majority of my energy, it wouldn't be into figuring out nimbyism and its impact. I would argue it exists, not in my backyard, but I don't see it as a major obstacle to moving forward the housing projects we need to move forward. That would be my assessment. I know that's not entirely, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't sometimes impede, but I don't see it as a central source of frustration to the kinds of things we need to do to move forward.
Michael.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, in New York region, I'd agree with John. Like, I mean, sometimes the media also gives voices to, there's a concern, but we're talking about one or two, a handful of individuals that are pretty vocal, right? And you're never going to convince those. It's not like the reasonable and say, yeah, you're right. I'm hoped, but for the most part, no. But when you even look recently in the city of Toronto, there was a parking lot they were turning into modular housing, and there was a comment that that parking lot was the heart of the community, and so it baffles you. And again, who knows what context that was taken? But kudos to Brad Bradford, the councillor there. He talked exactly how the mayor's talking. Like, this is a need. It's a parking lot. We got to use the space. A community involves all people. Right. I loved what Adam Vaughn once said. He said, someone experiencing homelessness is just a neighbor without a home. And it's that simple.
What do you want to leave people with in terms of a balanced kind of approach? And what do you feel like our communities can advocate for? Like, where would you suggest that we kind of put some of our time and energy? I'll go to Michael and then John.
Well, an example of that was just a little while back in our provincial election. That's where you put your time and energy. That's where your voice is. Vote. We saw, I think, 43% voter turnout, which was like 14% less than last time. That's sad to see. Housing was huge on the agenda, both provincially and in the last federal election, which is the work of some amazing and hardworking people to push that. You've got to spend your time and energy talking, having conversations with people like Mayor Taylor, with your regional councillors, with your provincial representatives, your MPPs, your MPs, pushing the pieces around, I'd say, affordable, truly affordable housing, building that, getting it built quick, and making sure that they're all working together to have these things built quick as the money flows through. And I said, this income piece has got to change. Until we address that, the number of people in need of assistance, whether it's through a basic type of income or something a little steadier, but we need to increase those rates. And until we do that, there's going to be so many people that will be a challenge to lift out of poverty. It can be done. This is very solvable.
Yeah, I would say that I think that, and I'll start with the optimistic part. I'm optimistic because I see more of the public than ever before engaged in the topic of affordable housing. They're concerned about it in a real and tangible way for their own children now, which brings it right to home. And that makes me a little optimistic. And so what I would say to all of those people is we need the public to engage their governments and demand that tangible things are done. And when I say tangible, I mean tangible and aggressive and transformational things. It's the time for tinkering is over. I'll be a little provocative, but why are we building any single family homes in the GTA anymore that do not have fully finished basement apartments in them? I mean, that is a starting point. I mean, first of all, we need to increase density considerably, but if we're still building single family homes, why in good, we've got people all over the place declaring, that we have a housing crisis and we're still building a house without an apartment below it. And we've got to move more aggressively on the, separate second suites in the backyards or above garages. We've got to move on every front, housing trusts, co-ops, apartments, rental, subsidized, and greater, and frankly, the biggest one, which is to demand that the land and housing industries provide greater support, enabled through provincial legislation, to provide for various forms of housing, affordable housing, and subsidized housing. And there's many ways we have to move forward, but if the people in our communities are where I think they are, they need to speak up and say, this matters to us, these are our values, and we demand it. And that's going to be the turning point.
Well, I want to thank you both. I think you've given us lots to think about. So just to close out, beyond the suburban blueprint of family homes in York Region, there are many faces and many stories about the deepening housing crisis in these communities. The reasons why a person may experience precarious housing or homelessness vary with each individual situation. Accessible and affordable housing is a fundamental right. Our guests today have shared their experiences and some new initiatives that can change the narrative and the lives of vulnerable and marginalized populations. As a community, we can create change in York Region. Season 3 of Hidden Stories of York Region was written and produced as a collaboration with the Aurora Public Library. Hidden Stories of York Region is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on social media platforms of the Social Planning Council of York Region and the Aurora Public Library. If you enjoyed this episode, please like us and share it with others and be part of the change.